The first speaker is actually a returnee. She did a talk last year. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Breda Corish.
Well, thank you. It's lovely. I feel very honoured, very privileged to be almost like opening the festival this morning on such a glorious day in such an incredibly beautiful setting. So if any of you were at my talk at the festival last year, I was looking at the Irish in Hackney in the 1880s. You can hear my accent. I'm Irish. I've been living here for decades, and finding Ireland in the long history of London is really my thing. So come with me this morning. We are going to imagine ourselves back in the middle of the 19th century. Here you can see Mare Street. In the last 50 years, Hackney's population, which had been only about 12,000 people in 1801, has more than quadrupled. And in what had been a largely rural area, the new pace of urban development has seen this brand new train station open right in the middle of Hackney. But as we can see in this very bucolic image of Stoke Newington's Lordship Road from the same time, urban development still has quite a way to go in this part of northeast London. Now, coming to the Irish in London. So by now, in 1851, Irish migration to England has become predominantly urban in character. And what this map is showing you, it's a representation of the census districts of 1851. The darker colours are showing you where the Irish-born population was the highest. So, perhaps not surprisingly, those are in the central areas of Whitechapel and St Giles in the Fields, which have been areas of Irish occupation for many, many centuries. In those areas, the Irish-born population overall is over 10%, and there's an unquantifiable number of people who are, of course, of Irish descent, going back many generations. By contrast, Hackney in the north and Wandsworth in the south, the palest colours, had the smallest Irish-born populations, and depending upon the individual census sub-district, that could be anything from 0 to about 1.8%. And that kind of begs the obvious question, well, if the numbers were so small, why did I even bother to look at this topic for the festival? So to answer that, first of all, we kind of have to look at the bigger picture. So in 1851, London's Irish-born population had increased by almost 50% in a decade. In 1841, the population was only 75,000. This map is showing you 109,000 Irish-born people. And if you know your Irish history, you won't be surprised to hear that the primary driver of that increase was the catastrophic event known in Ireland as An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger of 1845 to 1852. And this was famously depicted in the pictorial journalism of the Illustrated London News. In February 1847, it published these images from West Cork, and they were some of the most widely circulated images of the famine at the time. And over the course of the famine years, over 1 million people died in Ireland from disease and starvation. Another 2 million, it's estimated, emigrated. And although it's referred to as quite often as the potato famine, we need to think about this as being the combined results of the repeated failures of the potato crop in what was a very undeveloped part of what was then the United Kingdom. There was also the influence of the political ideologies of the day and how they influenced and shaped the changing responses of the Westminster governments. And it has to be said this was all influenced by what was a very widely held view at the time of the Irish Catholic poor as feckless and, in the words of the time, in need of civilization. So the scale of that demographic disaster can make it quite difficult to think about the Irish migrant experience of the mid-19th century through anything other than the really terrible experiences of these rural Irish poor. Which brings me back to the question, so why did I bother to look at this very small Irish-born population in this area in 1851? Well, the answer to that lies in the fact that local history studies, which of necessity have a focus on smaller populations in a particular place, they have the benefit of allowing us to examine the past at more of a micro level. And that means we can uncover local nuances and how people's individual circumstances shape their lives, which I hope you will share my impression that what this talk and what this research has revealed is that there are some quite surprising examples of the greater variety of the Irish migrant experience at that time than might be suggested by the single dominant historical narrative of the Great Hunger. So, with that context, we're going to take a deep dive now into the Hackney and Stoke Newington census districts of 1851. I have to give credit here to Cambridge University. Some years ago, they did an incredible project where they did a vast amounts of crunching of the census data over the centuries. And because that information is publicly available, it makes this sort of analysis possible. So what you can see is there were 58,400 people were enumerated in this area. The census sub-districts I'm looking at are Hackney, West Hackney, South Hackney, Stamford Hill and Stoke Newington. Back then as now, women tended to live longer than men, which is why the dark blue bars are higher than the orange bars. And because the 1851 census, for the first time, systematically recorded country of birth for everyone, what we can see is that in 1851, 95% of this area's census population was born in England. Just over 1% were born in Ireland, so that was 669 people in total. Less than 1% in Scotland, barely 0.5% came from Wales. Interestingly, over 2.5% of the local population, 808 people, they were born all over the world. Most of them came from Germany and France, followed by Indonesia, Jamaica, and India, and then there's a long list of other countries of ones and twos. Now, very helpfully, the Census Project at Cambridge University then mapped all of the written descriptions of people's occupations onto standardized codes. So what you can see in this chart is that the 222 Irish-born men and boys were involved in 86 occupation types, whereas the 379 Irish women and girls, sorry, I've just misread my notes and the slides completely. Let me start again. The 222 Irish-born men and boys were involved in 86 occupation types, whereas the higher number, the 379 Irish-born women and girls, were involved in only 28 occupation types. So I crunched the data a little bit more myself to get a better sense of what these gendered patterns of work were looking like. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, you'll notice that no occupation data was recorded for 37% of the women and the girls. Now, that does not mean they were not working. Rather, it reflects the long historical practice of not viewing women's work in the home, whether looking after their own families or doing paid piecework, has not traditionally been viewed as productive work. The scholar Anne McClintock has this great line. She says, "The domestic labour of women suffered one of the most successful vanishing acts of modern history." But when it came to paid employment, what you can see is almost half, 46% of the women were working in service, and mainly as live-in domestic servants. And that reflected two widespread trends at the time. Domestic service was the single largest employer of all women in Britain. And interestingly, women as a whole were more likely than men to be geographically mobile, and it was the opportunity, or indeed the need to work in domestic service, was a key factor in encouraging women's migration. However, while it was evident, the census stats show us that Irish women were either popular or at the very least accepted as domestic servants in this area, that wasn't a universal feeling. And if you scroll through the newspaper ads of the time, you do occasionally, not all the time, but you occasionally see examples, like this one comes from Clapton Place in 1854, which explicitly state in varying terms, "No Irish need apply." And despite the amount of academic work that's kind of gone on into the migrant experience, we actually still know very little about Irish women's experience working in domestic service at this time. And that stands in huge contrast to the United States, where you may be aware that the term Bridget became synonymous with the Irish domestic servant and in fact with Irish women in general. The scholar Bronwyn Walter, who specialises in Irish women's migration experience, I mean, she has observed that Irish servants in England acquired no such label and remained very much less visible. But if we go back to the Irish-born men and boys, basically there was so much variety, and there are 86 occupation types, I couldn't even condense it into an easily readable chart. So just to highlight two things, you'll notice only 11% had no occupation data recorded, and they were basically young teenagers. And even though the absolute numbers are small, I was struck by the fact that slightly more men were working in business occupations, primarily as clerks, than in the kind of building construction trades, which have such a strong association with our historic image of the male Irish migrant worker. Saying that, you know, there is a big group of people who are working as carters and general labourers and dockers and so on. With that context, for the rest of the talk, we're going to take a closer look at a few small groups of Irish people living in the area at the time. But I have to stress, the reason I chose these people is because those were the people for whom I was able to find sufficient records that we could actually trace their lives and their experiences. As so often is the case, the vast majority of the average person living and working in the area, it's just very hard to follow their lives. So, you may be surprised to see that we are beginning with Irish-born Anglican clergy, of which there was a grand total of 5 living in the area in 1851. But those 5 represented 12% of all the Anglican clergy in the area at the time. And given that the Irish-born made up only just over 1% of the local population, why were these clergymen so overrepresented? Well, I think we can find the answer in these maps of Ireland's religious affiliations. This was first systematically recorded in 1861. So you can see the green map is showing you that 78% of Ireland's population were Roman Catholic. On the far side, just 9% in the north were Presbyterians. And then the map in the middle is showing you that only 11.9% belonged to the Anglican Church of Ireland. Now, Anglicanism in Ireland had always been the established state religion, and what that meant was the majority population were obliged to make tithe payments for the upkeep of a church to which they did not belong. And in the 1830s, there was a very sustained campaign of opposition to tithe payments, you know, sometimes just not paying, quite a lot of intimidation and violence involved in that as well. And there's a long saga behind that, but essentially the outcome was that the Church of Ireland's income had significantly decreased by the middle of the 19th century. So I think we can imagine in those circumstances, and combined with the circumstances of the famine, you can understand why an Anglican parish in England could have looked rather more attractive for the Irish clergy. And that sense of what's been termed a defensive minority in Ireland, perhaps this explains why there was a man called Thomas Lanfear, 60 years old. He was living in Summerford Road in West Hackney, and I was astounded to see this. He declared on his census return not just that he was born in Ireland, but that he was a Protestant born in Ireland. Now, so far, I've managed to identify 4 out of those 5 Irish Anglican clergy. Charles Ingham Black was a curate assistant at Homerton. Charles Don Daniel was also based at St. Barnabas in Homerton. A man called John Gore was a curate at St. Jude's in Bethnal Green. And lastly, on your right, my left, George Crowley. He was a very well-known writer, reviewer, poet, novelist, and clergyman in his day. He was the rector of St. Stephen Walbrook in the City of London, and his fame as a preacher and orator was such that in 1841, the Bronte sisters, Charlotte and Anne, they actually made a special trip to the church in the hope of hearing him speak. But Reading the obituaries published upon Crowley's death in 1860, I was very surprised to come across that phrase we saw earlier, "no Irish need apply." And it seems that back in 1847, perhaps coincidentally, the worst year of the famine in Ireland, the then Anglican Bishop of London had, in the words of the newspaper, objected to the invasion of his diocese by Irish curates. Some attributed this to Bishop Blomfeld's view that the education given by Dublin's Trinity College just wasn't good enough. If there's any Trinity graduates in the room, not having a go at you. I have also read that the bishop was very opposed to the evangelical movement within the Anglican Church, and that by the mid-century was the dominant version of Anglicanism in Ireland. Nonetheless, the Dublin-born George Crowley had already been appointed rector of St. Stephen Walbrook by 1835. And he describes himself as an Irishman, but it's clear that Irish identity in the mid-19th century could be viewed through very different lenses at the same time. So these are quotes from various newspapers. His obituaries refer to the fact that his eloquence was associated with very famous Irishmen, the philosopher Edmund Burke, the playwright Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and the MP Henry Grattan. He, in fact, had temporarily won legislative freedom for the Irish Parliament in Dublin. But on the other hand, from Britain's leading Catholic newspaper at the time, he was also described as a Hibernian importation of rabid Irish Protestantism and clerical intolerance, because Crowley was also using his oratorical skills to denounce the Roman Catholic Church, and this was, in the 1850s, there was a widespread anti-Catholic sentiment in Britain at the time. Saying that, Irish identity clearly wasn't a barrier to his popularity with his Anglican congregation. This ornate memorial was erected in his honour in St. Stephen Walbrook. And in the same church, there is also a memorial to his eldest son. Now, you'll be able to read the detail on this, but he was a lieutenant in the Bengal Light Infantry. And this image depicts where Crowley's son died gloriously in the Victorian vernacular at Firozshah in the Indian state of Punjab today. And this was one of the fiercest battles fought in 1845 by the forces of the British East India Company. If you're not familiar with the background, the East India Company was a corporation first founded in 1600. It was given a monopoly on British trade with the East, and they basically developed their own private army to enforce their rule over the Indian subcontinent. So the younger Crowley's presence at this battle reminds us that despite Ireland being England's first colony back in the 12th century, as we will see, Irish people from all sorts of backgrounds were actors in the British imperial project over the centuries. So if we return to the census data, we can see that at the time, living in the area were 115 people who were working or had worked for the East India Company, and over half of them were born in Ireland. I should say here, if you want to know more about this topic, Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones is giving a talk on this at 3 o'clock in Sutton House tomorrow. Now, why were all of these Irish-born East India Company employees here? Well, it was because of the presence of the Pembroke House Lunatic Asylum on Mare Street, which I've highlighted in the box here, and to give you a sense, it's kind of hard to read the map, the highlighted street on the other side is Wells Street. So it's just at that junction of Mare Street and Wells Street. And Pembroke House was one of the many private madhouses, in the language of the day, that were set up in the area from the 18th century onwards. And Pembroke House had been contracted to treat East India Company employees who had been diagnosed as having developed in India what was then understood as insanity in many forms. And the reason for contracting the asylum in Hackney was because it was believed that their treatment would be more successful once they were basically back in England and away from the heat of the Indian climate. So, not expecting you to be able to read this, but it just gives you a sense. This is one of the census returns to illustrate how, on the night of the 1851 census, over half of the 109 patients in Pembroke House had been born in Ireland. And that isn't actually so surprising when we consider the fact that by mid-century, the Bengal Army, now this was the largest and most important of the three military forces maintained by the East India Company, by mid-century, they had sourced almost half of their European recruits from Ireland. And Ireland's stratified society was reflected in that recruitment. So typically, officers were usually Anglo-Irish and Protestant, exemplified like the young George Crowley. Regular soldiers were usually Catholic, Irish, and a lot of the time came from an agricultural labouring background. Now, today, anyone can register as a reader with the British Library, and there you can look through what you can see here, the Register of Admissions for Pembroke House, and the other side is one of the case books. It says 1849, but it actually covers a longer period. And turning over the pages, it's really striking. You get a sense of some inmates, as they were described, were in there for a very long time. My impression was that only about 10 to 20 people were admitted each year as new patients. You also see just how many surnames were recognisably Irish. So I've chosen this page from 1860 because it just so happens to have a long list of details recording where in Ireland patients were being sent from the asylum to their friends and family members. Whether that meant they were being sent back home because they were cured, or they were being sent back home to make space or save costs, I'm not quite sure. You can also see individual case notes, kind of hard reading. It's very, very tiny copperplate writing. It can make for very poignant reading. I chose this one almost at random. This man, he was originally from Broadway, County Wexford in the southeast of Ireland. He was admitted to Pembroke House in Hackney in June 1851, and his case notes say that he had been suffering for several months from what in India, from what the local medical officer had described as phantoms which haunt his disturbed imagination night and day. And 6 years later, his condition was described as just the same. I doubt, in fact, I'm quite sure we will never know what these individuals fighting on behalf of the East India Company, what they did themselves or what they witnessed to create these phantoms which haunted their minds. So on that somewhat sober thought, we're moving on to another not very cheerful topic, the workhouse. This was located on the south side of Homerton High Street, so just east of the Homerton train station where it is today, again highlighted in the red box there. Again, give you a little bit of context. Following the poor law legislation of 1834, parishes have been grouped together into what was termed a poor law union. Within each union, you had a building complex that was called a workhouse, and this is where the poor of the locality were to be admitted to receive relief, but only under living conditions which were deliberately designed to be very, very off-putting. And in the census of 1851, there were about 420 people living in the workhouse, 350 adult paupers and 65 children. The Irish-born listed here, so they made just up over 1% of the workhouse population, so broadly in line with the Irish presence in the surrounding district. You'll notice that the four Irish adults, Rosetta, Margaret, Michael and Timothy, they were all over 50 and widowed, whereas the only child, Daniel Warren up here, he wasn't even 6 years old, and he was in the workhouse because he had been abandoned by his father for reasons which we will never know. Rosetta Lee is quite a distinctive name, and that actually meant I was able to trace an outline of her life from various Hackney records. She was born in Dublin just before the turn of the century. At some stage, she married a man called Lee. I wasn't able to find out what her maiden name was. And then sometime before 1840, she was widowed. And that was the year she was first admitted to the Hackney Union Workhouse as a pauper. If you were a widowed woman, it was particularly difficult, and particularly if you had children, it was very difficult to find paid employment that would support you. The image up in the corner, these are pewter implements, 19th century pewter implements. They were actually found in the grounds of the workhouse when there was construction working on in the 1920s. They're not dated to any particular decade within the 19th century, but it gives you a sense of maybe the sort of things that Rosetta might have been using to eat her meals. We know then that 10 years later, in 1850, she was still in the workhouse, and the records tell us she had acquired settlement rights. That basically means she had a legal right to parish relief in Hackney, and this was because her father-in-law had rented a house in Shore Place for many years and other places in the parish, and importantly, he had paid all of his rates. 3 years later, Rosetta dies. She was 56. She had spent the last 13 years of her life as a pauper inmate of the Hackney Union Workhouse. She was buried in St John at Hackney, and sadly, as a pauper buried from the workhouse, she would have been buried in a common grave with no grave marker to memorialise her life. Now, thinking about orphans, Daniel Warren wasn't the only Irish-born child living without their parents in Hackney. The census also tells us there was another 5 in the London Orphan Asylum situated on Lower Clapton Road. Again, highlighted in red is Pariscroft Road, to give you a sense of where it was. So today, the asylum building is gone, but we can still see that very impressive Grade 2 listed portico outside Clapton Girls' School. It was first built in 1825 as a charity school by Andrew Reid. He was a nonconformist parson. He was actually the father of the future Sir Charles Reid, Hackney's first MP. And his stated aim in creating the orphan asylum was that it would care for children whose parents have been in respectable circumstances. And that meant children of professional men, of principals engaged in agriculture, manufacture, commerce or trade, of mercantile or other clerks, and of those in like position. However, children of journeymen and of domestic or agricultural services were ineligible. So then, who were the Irish-born children who met these criteria for the asylum? Now, what struck me when I first saw these 5 children in the census records was that how much surnames like Ferguson, Turpin, Sandwith, and Blake, they're not obviously recognizable as particularly Irish surnames. But I think we can get a clue about why this was so in the fact that the asylum aimed to, quote, settle the children as apprentices or domestic servants in approved Protestant households when they left. I have been able to find out the circumstances of Charles Cunningham Turpin. His Irish Anglican parents were from County Offaly and County Meath. They had died in 1843. And this card illustrates the sort of election process which Charles and all of the other children would have had to go through to be admitted to the London Orphan Asylum. Charity electioneering was a very popular philanthropic model at the time, and essentially what it meant was that the financial donors to a charity, its subscribers, they were given voting rights, and their votes determined who would benefit from the support of the charity. So how it worked was the child's mother, if she was still alive, or the child's guardians, would first have to persuade one of the asylum subscribers to sponsor the child's application for admission. The asylum's board's management would have to confirm that the child was indeed eligible by virtue of being healthy and the offspring of respectable parents. And then the child's mother, guardian, and their friends would start canvassing all of the people on the asylum subscriber list for their votes. And it was cards like this, which you can see in the Hackney Archives, This example is giving brief details of the child, candidate, and their sponsors. These had to be printed and posted out to secure enough votes for the child to gain a place in the asylum, because there was limited space every year. So given this sort of need for, if you like, social capital and influential friends and the religious ethos of the charity, I think we can safely assume that those Irish children in the London Orphan Asylum were all the products of respectable Protestant Irish families who had fallen on hard times. But what happened to people who fell on hard times and who did not have the benefit of respectability? Well, if you had ended up in prison, a network of institutions had begun to appear from the beginning of the 19th century as part of the prison reform movement, and the intention was to rehabilitate ex-prisoners and help them get back into respectable society. And one of these was a refuge for destitute females in Dalston, on Dalston Lane. This was originally on Hackney Road, with a separate male refuge in Hoxton, but then government funding was reduced in 1848, so the male refuge was closed, and resources were concentrated instead on this new female refuge, which opens in this building, which opened in Dalston. And once again, we had Hackney Archives to thank for access to the minute books, and you have an example of one of them there. On the night of the 1851 census, there were 42 female inmates in the refuge, mainly their teens or early 20s. Just 3 were born in Ireland. Catherine Caton, she was only 17. It's not clear what had brought her to the refuge, but within a few months, she was working as a domestic servant on Bowles Pond Road, and 6 months later, she was given a reward of 10 shillings by the refuge governors, and this was part of their incentive scheme, that once their employers, their new employers gave positive reports of their work, this was an incentive to keep them on their path to respectability. 20 years old Mary McDonough, she had been born in Galway. She had moved to England, where she worked in a new manufactory at Nottingham, where before she moved to Coventry, and she was convicted of stealing a loaf of bread, and for that she was imprisoned in Warwick Jail for theft at the age of 19. When she was admitted to the refuge, she was described as friendless but a hard-working woman and very desirous of being admitted. And a month later, she was sent to work for a laundress in Spitalfields. That's a destination which appears quite often in the records. So Catherine and Mary probably would have counted as success stories. The other Catherine Malloy, who was born in Queen's County, better known today as County Laois, she probably didn't count as a success story. She and her Liverpool-born friend Anne Thompson were admitted together from Liverpool jail. Within 6 months, she had applied to leave the refuge. The matron feared that they had formed some plan. We don't know what the plan was. But Catherine persisted in her request, and a week later she was released. And where life took her after that, I do not know. And now we move on to the last of the Hackney institutions where the census recorded Irish-born people living in 1851, the Elizabeth Fry Refuge. So I'm sure you'll all recognise this building on Mare Street. That was actually only occupied by the refuge from 1860. It had been named in honour of the first women's prison reformer. And it had the same ethos as the earlier founded Dalston Refuge. And again, Hackney Archives has one of the case books for this period. At that time, the original Elizabeth Fry Refuge was actually situated a little bit further south on Mare Street. It's close to the location of where St Joseph's Hospice is today. And we need to bear in mind is that getting into the refuge, despite there's a big religious ethos in there and that emphasis on respectability, could be a very attractive option. If your alternative was, as a young woman, you're coming out of prison, and just like today, if you didn't have a family or friends to go to, you could very easily end up in the street, and then you could very easily end up in the workhouse. But to get into the refuge, you had to have a record of good conduct and someone in a position of authority like a prison chaplain or magistrate, had to make a recommendation on your behalf. So in 1851, 20 women were as inmates in the refuge, having done time in any number of the prisons and local lockups, which made up Victorian London's landscape of incarceration. You see, I've highlighted here 3 women born in Ireland at the time. I'm just keeping an eye on the time, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to skip over some fascinating detail. Maybe if I just pull out one, Betty Duffy. So she arrived at the refuge after spending time in the Breda Corish prison for breaking windows. And the casebook notes, although short, dark and stout, Betty thought she was 17, she looked about 30. She had been working in service in Ireland for 2 years before coming to London. She had no parents, perhaps not surprisingly, given the famine circumstances. She did have an uncle in America, and after 4 months in the refuge actually helped her to emigrate to America, and by spring of the following year, she was recorded as being in a very respectable situation at a farmhouse, having 10 shillings weekly wages and board. And in the period between 1849 and 1853, covered by the casebook, 279 women were admitted and 25 were specifically described as Irish. There's another 25 with what I would term recognizably Irish surnames, so potentially almost 1/5 of the female intake of that period either came from Ireland or had some degree of Irish heritage. And while any sort of circumstances could have led women into prison, this sort of a fall from grace, a change in the circumstances. But I think we also have to bear in mind that for Irish women in particular, if they were arriving in London from famine-stricken Ireland, that really could have shaped their lives from the outset. So I've just highlighted here Margaret Collins. Sometime before January 1852, she came to London with her brother after their parents had died. Her brother sailed to Quebec. Left behind in London, Margaret sold fruit in the streets but soon became destitute from illness, and the curious crime of ringing the mansion house bell saw her sentenced to 14 days in the Bridewell. She ended up being taken to another refuge for destitute female prisoners at Manor Hall in Chelsea, but where life took her after that, I'm afraid I do not know. So, how do we draw all of these strands together to answer my opening question? Who were the Irish in Hackney and Stoke Newington during the time of the Great Famine in Ireland in 1851? Well, firstly, numbers. We know there was over 600 Irish-born people. We can't say how many of them had arrived directly as a result of emigration from famine-stricken Ireland, but it seems most of them were making their way to one extent or another in their new Hackney homes by 1851, mainly through domestic service in one shape or other if you're a woman, and through a wide variety of occupations for the men. Secondly, we've also seen how the religious tensions in Ireland were manifesting in some unexpected ways over here, whether it's the Bishop of London's hostility to the Irish Anglican clergy, and then to those 2 Irish Hackney residents who were at pains to stress they were not just Irishmen, but Protestant Irishmen. And then, of course, lastly, this Victorian enthusiasm for the institution as a solution to social problems and institutional record keeping, ironically, it means we know we can find out the most about the most marginalized people, the people who ended up in the workhouse or in the asylums or the refuges for the destitute. And then lastly, where do the Irishmen living on Mayor Street in the East India Company's lunatic asylum fit into this narrative? They came from a colonized country while being engaged in the act of colonizing another country. They were soldiers who perpetrated colonial violence at the same time as being patients suffering from severe psychiatric illnesses as a result of their services for the company. So I think perhaps more than anybody else who's featured in this talk, I think they demonstrate just how much the small scale of local history studies can reveal that the past is more complicated than any one overarching narrative. And with that closing thought, I would like to say thank you for your time this morning. And we still have time for questions.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. We have time, about 10 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We probably won't get to them all. We do have a roving mic, but if you're confident enough to just stand up and say it loud, then do that. I think this lady here was the first.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. Thank you. It's so interesting, as you say, to see how complex things are. And I wondered, I was particularly struck with the soldiers going to fight in India for the East India Company. And you said there was a hierarchy, so the Protestants were more the officers and then the rural Catholics were more the soldiers, which you know from statistics. I wonder if you have any idea of, it's so interesting they went from a colonized country to colonized. So was it that they sort of accepted colonialism somehow? Or, so my question, I guess, is how, would you have any resources to get at what they thought, their reasons and their,
So great question. And like I say, I strongly suspect that Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones will probably be talking about this again tomorrow as well. I'm flicking through here because I want to find a name. So basically, there's been quite a lot of research has been done into this. In recent years, academic scholarship and research has been looking at, I suppose, this kind of more multifaceted perspective on Ireland and where it fitted into the imperial project. Again, like on that theme about single dominant historical narratives. Probably for a very long time that wasn't really talked about. So now, in fact, there is a lot of research out there, and I am just trying to find, there are some papers which are available online. I'll just give you the name. There's, just calling out just one particular name, there's a scholar called Alexander Bubb, and I think he actually, B-U-B-B, I think he actually did his PhD in this, and then a number of his papers are freely available. He specifically looked at the life of the Irish soldier in India. So I'm just thinking back to when I was reading those, why did they join up? And it's very, very basic reasons. Really, it wasn't about people thinking about, oh, I'm part of a colonial service. Very, very basic. It was well paid. So imagine if you were an Irish agricultural labourer, the Great Famine in Ireland in the mid-19th century was just one in a long string of famines. There had been actually in the late 1739, I think the year of the Great Frost here, 1822, the 1830s. So there's this long history of agricultural distress in Ireland. You're better paid as a soldier. For a long time, technically, if you're Catholic, you weren't supposed to be recruited by the British Army. In actual fact, that did happen. The East India Company didn't have that restriction, and they paid more. So for all of those very practical reasons, if you're if you're an agricultural labourer, and you've got an opportunity for better pay. Oh, and let's come back to me. And the other point that was in the papers I was reading, the East India Company very actively recruited the Irish soldier. If you looked at, despite the times of agricultural distress in Ireland, if you contrasted the rural Irish worker with, say, the urban English worker, quite often the Irish agricultural labourer was seen as healthier and stronger. It has complicated and problematic associations as well with these ideas of how uncivilized people were in Ireland as well. But there's a lot of reasons, and it's a fascinating topic, and I definitely encourage you to go out and a little bit of Googling will bring you to some of those sources. There's another mic there.
Thank you for citing my paper. I'm Alex Bubb. What a coincidence.
Fantastic.
But I certainly learned a lot about things that I didn't know from your presentation about my own area here. I was curious about the women. On the list of female occupations, there were several women when they were also working for the East India Company. So I thought, what kind of job would a woman do for the East India Company?
So so in the case of the Irish-born, the stats were a little bit confusing. It was either 1 or 2, and I am 90% certain they were actually inmates in the Pembroke House Lunatic Asylum. I couldn't tie up, when I looked at the records in the British Library, I couldn't tie that up specifically with the census period, but I did find one entry in the casebook for maybe about, I think it was about 1853, and it was a woman. She was the widow of an Irish soldier out there, and apparently, and again, I can't believe Alexander, you're here. Literally, this is not a plant. We have never met before. I cannot remember the exact date when the East India Company basically decided that they would pay for the wives and children to be treated as well. If we had more time, the entry in the casebook for this woman is fascinating. Her problems seemed to develop after she had a baby. There's some extraordinary language in there about that she was displaying very superstitious and bigoted behavior. Make of that what you will. And I think there was a gentleman at the back, and there was 6 here. Yeah.
Plan that, by the way.
Yeah, I remember my mum telling me in Kentish Town the classic no dogs, no blacks, no Irish in various places. And I was interested to see your quoting, or you showed pictures of advertisements in the 1850s, you know, suggesting that. And I really want to get inside that. I mean, you know, were a young Irish woman unable to speak English, possibly not their first language? Were they rural and clumsy, in inverted commas? I mean, were they Catholic and so therefore not as wanted as Protestants? So what is the reason for objecting to Irish servants?
I would possibly say all of the above. So let me step back a little bit, just on the point about the ads. So when I was obviously kind of just doing some almost kind of like random sampling of just kind of scrolling through some of the newspapers, one thing that I was struck by was I saw most of these in, gosh, I'm having a blank now. There's a newspaper, the Morning Post. There's a newspaper that was set up by the Licensed Fiddlers Association. It's not the Morning Post, it's called something else, which was, you know, a mainstream newspaper, but it was basically where typically where we would find the ads for people looking for employing staff for bars and public houses. And that was actually where I saw most of those. Again, this is not a systematic quantitative analysis, but when I was going through that, I happened to see a letter sent into one of those papers, basically calling out the public house trade for being particularly noted for their saying they didn't want Irish staff. So there's, I suppose you can imagine circumstances if you are coming from a rural agricultural area, and it's particularly in somewhere like the west of Ireland, and you don't have English necessarily as your first language, or maybe you're bilingual and you don't have that experience, so maybe you're not going to be so great to take on as a housemaid. But obviously, there is a lot of anti-Irish sentiment, and I haven't get to my wrapping up time. A topic basically I would like to go back and look at, because again we have this association with Hackney and Stoke Newington being these kind of bastions of non-conformity and a very particular form of evangelical Protestantism as well. And that also has a very complicated presence in Ireland. So I suppose one of the things that we don't know is all of those women who were working in domestic service in Hackney and Stoke Newington, for all we know, they might have been lots of good Protestant girls. But I think that's a whole topic that merits further research, and to the best of my knowledge hasn't really been looked into as yet.
Okay, Apologies that we don't have time for any more questions, but could we give Breda another big round of applause?